Okay, wonderful. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Natalie Baumdad and I'm a consultant with MAG and part of the team that developed this webinar. We are so glad that you're here and so excited to see all the enthusiasm around exploring this topic, the intersection of systems change and equity. I just want to remind all the panelists, or all the participants that you are on mute, and we're going to turn off the chat setting, but the panelists will be able to see your questions and your comments, so we'll be taking stock of that throughout the presentation. Before we dive into introductions, I want to talk a little bit about why we're here and why we're doing this. So for the past couple years, MAG has been deepening our understanding around systems change, complex systems change. And as we were doing that research, it became increasingly clear to us that mainstream conversations around systems change were often led by men, by white men, and by white dominant institutions. And we also noticed that this, despite the fact that most systems change efforts were geared towards working towards equity and ending disparities, those same values weren't always present or reflected in the work and how it was done and how it was talked about. So last fall, we partnered with the Building Movement project, and Sean will tell you a little bit more about that in just a second, Building Movement and MAG. And we asked the question, what does it look like when systems change actually grapples with deep racial equity and power? What are some of the examples from practitioners who are people of color, who are immigrants, who are women, who are youth, people we know who are already doing this work, but maybe have a different language, a different way of talking about it. And so we started those initial conversations. And through that process, we developed a framework for the qualities that distinguish conventional systems change efforts from what we're really talking about today, systems change that centers power and race. And I want to say that this framework was like shepherded by MAG and the Building Movement project, but many people had a hand in helping to build this and build the framework that you're going to see today. That includes, partners in the justice ecosystem, grassroots practitioners, and a lot of the systems change practitioners from the groups that I just mentioned before. I want to talk also a little bit about our agenda for today. It's going to happen in 3 parts. First, we're going to build a shared language around what we mean by systems change and equity. We have a really diverse group of people on the call today. We have folks who have a really deep practice in equity. We have folks who do systems change work, but are maybe not as far along on their journey. And so this first section is geared towards helping kind of build a shared understanding of what those 2 words mean to us in this context. And so given that, some of those initial slides might feel like too little context or too much context depending on where you are. So I just want to flag that, that reality. And then the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to share this framework for you. What does it look like to actually do systems change work with attention to race, with attention to equity, with attention to power? And we're going to hear from Reverend Ross and from Lauren Padilla-Valverde, practitioners who are really going to bring that framework to life for us. And then the last thing that we're going to do is talk a little bit about the process. How do we build a mindset around systems change and equity and build the muscles to actually do this work well? What does that process look like? We're going to have interactive polls throughout the presentation. As I mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to chat them and we'll respond to you. But we've disabled chat for all participants. So we'll see your chats, but you might not chats. This presentation will be recorded and we will also share out slides with participants following the presentation. So without further ado, I want to give Sean and Sean and Susan an opportunity to introduce themselves. Sean, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So hello, everybody. Great to have so many people participating in this webinar. My name's Sean Thomas Breitfeld. I'm the co-director of the Building Movement Project, and you can see my headshot along with Noelia, who you can also see as the host of this. She's waving at you. And then Frances Kunreiter is my co-director here at BMP, and so that's her picture as well. BMP is a national research organization that focuses on developing research and resources to support, but also to push nonprofit organizations to be more focused on progressive social change and to align their sort of everyday operating practices with the social change values and commitment. So that's a little bit about who BMP is. Susan, you want to introduce yourself and the MAG team?
Sure. My name is Susan Misra. I'm the co-director for Management Assistance Group. You can see our full team there. And I won't go over everybody's name because that will take a while. But a little bit about Management Assistance Group, and that is that we are a social justice organization that provides both consulting and coaching, and we run innovation learning labs, specifically to look at 5 elements that we think are really critical to social transformation. And those are deep equity, complex systems change, leaderful ecosystems, multiple ways of knowing, and inner work. So that's a little bit about MAG. I'm very excited to be here now.
I also want to give our speakers and practitioners an opportunity to introduce themselves. Reverend Ross, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Sure. I'm Reverend Joan Ross. I head up 2 organizations on the north end of Detroit. One is the Storehouse of Hope, which formed in 2007 as a collaborative of 15 organizations around providing meal services and pantry services, as well as wraparound services to the prisoners who were in early release programs that were just dumped on the north end every Thursday. Today, we operate the Emergency Food Pantry, providing emergency food and services to nearly 3,000 individuals monthly, as well as we operate the only community land trust in Detroit, which was formed in 2015 around the unconstitutional tax foreclosures that took place and are still taking place in our city. The other organization that I oversee is the North End Woodward Community Coalition, which was actually birthed out of the Storehouse of Hope. And it started as a transit justice group seeking to provide a just transit system. But today, in collaboration with 3 other partners, that organization has grown, and we provide internet services as well as all kinds of solar and environmental services, and the only community radio station in Detroit. I do have to say that I am a volunteer for both of these organizations, and I don't receive any foundation funding.
Thank you, Reverend Ross. Lauren, would you say a few words about yourself and your work?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be with you all and an honor to be sharing what I'm learning together here with Reverend Ross. My name is Lauren Padilla-Valverde. I'm a senior program officer with the California Endowment, a private statewide health foundation here in California. I am first and foremost the daughter of Guatemalan immigrants who came to this country fleeing persecution and for standing up for the rights of the people in Guatemala to own their land and to and that's what my father did as a community organizer. So what I do in my work is really rooted in his philosophy. I currently am with the California Endowment and serve as the point person and program officer for overseeing the grant-making strategy in the central coast of California in a place known as Monterey County. And my work focuses on building resident leadership and power to advocate for the long game of systems change that's rooted in a healing-informed racial justice practice.
Thank you, Lauren. I also want to give us a chance to learn about who else is on the webinar today. So I'd love to just initiate our first poll. And this poll, you'll see it, I think it'll pop up right on your screen. We want to learn about what your role is. And if you're a systems change practitioner, what is your role within your systems change effort? So we'll give you all a couple seconds to just fill that out. And while you're doing that, I want to invite folks who are on Twitter or interested in following the conversation on social media. You can use the hashtag systems and equity. It's written on the bottom of each slide to follow the conversation along there. Okay, great. So, I think this graph is really telling. I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that we were anticipating a really diverse audience. We have funders, we have several nonprofit representatives, several capacity builders. I think there will be pieces of today's presentation that will resonate really deeply with all of you in different ways. And so I'm excited to see how that plays out. I also just, as we move along, want to give folks an opportunity to ground themselves in Reverend Ross and Lauren's stories of systems change. So Reverend Ross, I'd love for you to just briefly talk about some of the work that you've been doing in Detroit.
So thank you. Back in 2013, actually, under President Obama, the opportunity came that airways were opened up to communities. These are the low power frequencies, the static, if you will, that's between stations. He opened up the opportunity for community organizations and faith-based groups to actually have access to owning and operating their own community radio station. In 2014, we applied as one of 4 groups in Detroit, but the only one who actually was licensed by the FCC, as well as Canada, to operate our own community radio station. We have been a voiceless community, but we're not really voiceless. We've just been deliberately silenced into, or bullied actually into silence. And have not had an opportunity to share. We, like most communities of color, didn't own media. We did not hear that it was possible for us to own media. And the stories that were coming out of Detroit were not Detroiters telling those stories. At least it wasn't grassroots Detroit that was telling the story. Often what was said about us was not really reflective of the story and the work that was actually going on the ground in community at that time. The stories that you heard were basically from white media, and it was what the mayor and media wanted you to know. Even now, what you hear about Detroit and the great comeback doesn't really tell the story of grassroots and community and what's happening here in Detroit. So we took the opportunity to apply for 96.7 FM, which is a 58-watt terrestrial signal that's coming off of a tower located on the very edge of that comeback area. Now we broadcast 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with programming that's created by grassroots community members about the issues and the stories that are really happening in our city. Our shows and our programs reflect topics that promote social justice, solidarity, and visionary activism. We engage local youth and we teach them broadcasting skills, creating a platform for podcasting, which will enable our stories to go on, not just for today, but be a deposit for our future.
Thank you, Reverend Ross, and we'll be hearing more about that story and specifically about Reverend Ross's experience as an individual and as kind of the experience of the community engaging with the system that is media in Detroit. Lauren, I'd love to, if you could share your story with the group and a little bit about your work in Monterey County.
Sure, of course. Thank you so much, Natalie. So this vision, this dream of towards a racially equitable Monterey County, which was officially launched in February of this year, comes through the legacy of a long march towards racial and social justice in the region, this region and the Central Coast of California. Specifically, I want to talk to you all a little bit about how this launch came to be. The California Endowment is a private statewide health foundation here in California, and our primary mission is to make fundamental improvements in the health outcomes of all Californians. In 2009, the foundation announced the launch of Building Healthy Communities, a 10-year place-based community change initiative taking place in 14 California communities, from as far north as the border with Oregon to as far south as San Diego and City Heights, and all in between. The goal of Building Healthy Communities at the outset was to achieve health equity and equitable outcomes for all people through a policy and systems change focus. And that to achieve this, we would center our investments and our grant making in building the youth and adult leadership capacity to center resident power in decision-making processes, both at in government, but also within the ecosystem of institutions that impact those communities directly. And that our focus would be on those youth and adult residents who are most systemically impacted by the inequities. I oversee, there's 14 communities that are part of this journey, this 10-year journey, and I oversee the grant-making strategy for the one community in Monterey County. The initial grant-making for Building Healthy Communities, as I just shared, was focused on supporting resident leadership to advocate for organizing around issues that were important to their community and that had a direct impact on health inequities. These grants initially focused on, were very diverse. We were funding everything from health career pathways to increasing access to healthcare services for our undocumented residents, always again centering resident leadership in this advocacy work. From the beginning, also, what we also recognized, which was key, was in asking residents to organize and advocate, we also had, and recognizing that we were asking folks who are residents who are most impacted, that we had to really ground and support resident leaderships through a healing-centered framework, meaning that we weren't just going to ask residents to show up, but that we were going to invest in their leadership capacity and support their healing for their, not just for themselves, but for their neighborhoods. And that healing was grounded in a culturally rooted way. Fast forward 2014, our community experienced 4 police officer involved shooting deaths of unarmed men in the span of 4 months. This series of episodes catalyzed an opportunity for Building Healthy Communities residents and grassroots organizations together with this foundation to get the city of Salinas to agree to going through a racial healing, racial equity week in 2014. And in November of that same year, we held what was called a Racial Healing, Racial Equity Week, where over 100 City of Salinas department heads and staff, including the police department, together with Building Healthy Communities, with the support of 2 organizations, Race Forward and the National Compadres Network, worked to really understand the trauma that our communities were going through and how government has played a role in perpetuating that, even though that may not be the intention, or it may be. So through that launch, what happened was the community, together with government, recognized that we can't just keep doing more of the same. We have to focus on what part of our institutions are creating and perpetuating the inequities. This work of moving our systems from focusing on an initiative or a project to taking more of an inward reflection approach has expanded into an ecosystem of stakeholders in the region to include philanthropy, government, nonprofits, community organizing, where we're centering healing-informed racial equity across the entire region. This work requires deep emotional fortitude to name the legacy of systemic racism and other forms of oppression that hinder us from achieving equity. This ecosystem, known as Towards a Racially Equitable Monterey County, recognizes that this is not just an outcome or even a process, that it is a developmental journey that begins with self-transformation, healing self, healing families, healing neighborhoods, and healing systems. I'll stop there.
And so thanks both to Reverend Ross and to Lauren for sharing some of those initial stories. You're going to hear much more from each of them as we dig more into the framework. But before we jump into the conversation about systems change with an equity lens, we want to ground this discussion in this webinar in some shared language around what we mean by deep equity. These are concepts that you're probably already familiar with, but it's always helpful to talk about what we actually mean when we are focusing on a level of sort of deep equity, and the importance of having an understanding and analysis of the levels of racial inequity that exists in our country. And part of the reason that we're focusing on race in particular is because it's generally the most charged dimension of identity, but also it's the factor that has the greatest impact on life chances and life opportunities. And so when we're thinking about deep equity, we have to think in terms of the inequity that shows up in ways that are internalized. So from the messages that we hear and that shape our view of ourselves and society, interpersonal in terms of the dynamics between two people and the way that interpersonal prejudice impacts our experiences. There's also an institutional level of organizational policies and practices in terms of the institutions that we navigate. And then there's the structures of the laws, the societal policies, the decision-making bodies, the processes and protocols. And when we're thinking at all of those levels is when we have a systemic viewpoint. And to do systemic change, we have to have a strategy and be engaging all of the levels. It's always important and possible to do work at differing levels, so the structural level, the institutional level, the interpersonal, and the internalized level. All of those levels we need to be making progress on and working on in order to have deep equity at a systemic level. It requires attention at all of those levels. So continuing the conversation about what we mean by deep equity, I want to introduce this framework from Monica Dennis and Rachel Ibrahim around the importance of reckoning with the way that our experiences of inequity lead to recreating harm in our own lives and also in terms of the structures and strategies that we may set up in order to address the root problem. And so the diagram on the left shows the ways that oppression, the systems of oppression can perpetuate harm because, you know, this disassociating from the body, for instance, that we have to recognize that oppression hurts our bodies. Disconnecting from the source is about the way that, you know, the pressure, frankly, to assimilate is also a form of oppression, and it disconnects us from who we are. The distancing from emotion is about being out of touch and sort of accepting a level of numbness to the problems of inequity and particularly racial inequity. And then the distortion that happens in terms of the story, and this is part of what Reverend Ross was talking about earlier, that the narratives often are reinforcing the dominant culture and the dominant narratives. So in the case of Detroit, the dominant story about Detroit was not one that was real for the experience of people from and living in Detroit. And so we have to recognize all of the elements that perpetuate the systems of oppression in order to move towards some liberatory practices. And so this is where reconnecting to our source, reconnecting to our culture and history, and rejecting the pressure to cover or assimilate is a really important liberatory practice, as well as the, of going around the circle in terms of reclaiming our body, re-engaging with emotion, not shying away from the emotion and from the pain and anger that people may have about having overcome and survived the oppression, and then restoring story, which is a lot of what we'll be talking more about as well as the webinar continues. So then with deep equity, it's important to recognize that it's not just about eliminating disparities, right? So this is just as an example, one way that we can look at data to illustrate that there are inequities, right? There are racial and gender inequities. And so one viewpoint might be, well, the problem is that there are these differing inequities and we need to, make things equal, right? But what's missing as a data point in this image is that basically all of these groups are earning below white men, right? And so if the goal becomes to just standardize the inequity, we're not actually dismantling the problem. And so I'm seeing a question, what does API mean? API is shorthand for Asian and Pacific Islander. So again, to the point that just eliminating these disparities actually would not be achieving a just outcome. It also reflects the fact that the sort of white men being treated as the standard and the norm, it makes their experience, makes that invisible in this data point. Obviously everyone is sort of below that line. And so what we really need to be focused on is not just standardizing the inequity and removing these varying disparities, actually getting rid of the disparity that exists in the first place. And so that's just part of our thinking in terms of like what it means to be thinking about deep equity and achieving some just outcomes. So gonna move into another poll question. And so here what we want to know from you is, to what extent are you embedding deep equity into your own work? And so the poll is going to appear. So some may say that you're already doing it deeply, to some extent not at all. We'll take a little bit of time for people to weigh in with their votes, and then we'll continue with the webinar. All right, so it looks like the majority are embedding deep equity to some extent, and then roughly 22% doing it deeply, and then a small proportion not at all. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan to talk more about our perspective as we think about what a system is.
Great. Thanks so much, Sean. Now that we've gotten a little bit of shared understanding about what we mean by deep equity, we want to take a few minutes to talk about what is a system before we dive into equitable systems change. So a system is the relationships among interconnected structures and people. And it includes both of the diagrams that you see on the screen. The people who are on the right-hand side at all the levels that Sean was talking about, and the structures that you see on the left-hand side, the laws and policies, the process protocols, and the governing bodies. But a system is also an invisible net that is more than the sum of these parts, and it includes a lot of things that are not written on this screen. Those invisible components include power, norms, narratives, worldviews, collective unconscious, all the things that stir up the relationships among people and between people and structures. And also, of course, systems are historic. And in fact, their historic context cannot be divorced from the way that they're evolving today and into the future. So that actually means that systems, as you all know, are really messy, unpredictable, contentious, and emergent. And when you look at the boundaries of a system, they're actually very permeable, and people and structures come in and out of a system, and that actually has a significant impact on what the system looks like and feels like. And in fact, there's a lot of power to the folks that are actually trying to define what the boundaries of a system are. So speaking of boundaries, next slide. Because they are fluid, it means that systems can really overlap. Like this example on the left-hand side where you have the field of academic achievement, which is an intersection of systems of education, health, and juvenile justice. And also systems can be nested one level within another, like the right-hand side example where you have a system of a 7th grade classroom intersecting or within the educational sector. I think the most important thing that I want to leave you with when we're thinking about systems, there's so much, of course, that we could talk about, is that for us, systems change is not just changing the people component of a system or just changing the structural component of the system. It really is changing the people, the structures, the relationships between that, and the invisible elements of that net overall. So with that in mind, in terms of systems, we'd love to do another poll and just get a sense of, to what extent are you working in complex systems change? Deeply, to some extent, or not at all. So just pick one. I'm very curious to see where we are relative to the equity one.
And someone asked if the polls are anonymous. Yes, we can't see what individuals are answering.
Thanks, Natalie. Great. So this one is a little bit different than the equity one. 44% are deeply engaged in complex systems change, and a little over half to some extent. So again, the majority are doing systems change, just as the majority were doing some version of equity. And that's a great segue into talking about what do we mean by equitable systems change. So now we want to combine these two terms, equity and systems. And just as a reminder, our understanding of equitable systems change is actually evolving. We're trying to understand it through the lived experiences of people doing and facilitating the work on the ground. And this is part of that process, is working with you all, and hopefully into the future, it will continue to change. As you're looking at the how of equitable systems change, one of the things that you'll notice is that it's very similar between the conventional way of doing systems change and equitable systems change. You're still mapping forces, sensing patterns, experimenting with ways to influence the systems. Those are all very similar. So what really is different about equitable systems change? For us, that difference is about how we hold the work and to what end we are doing the work. And specifically, we're trying to lift up three things. One, we're trying to lift up the importance of shifting narratives, relationships, and power. Two, we are trying to lift up our actual individual and collective role in healing historic and current trauma. And three, we're trying to lift up being intentional about whether our efforts are actually transforming historic and current systems or simply replacing one inequity with another. Much to what Sean was saying about, are we just eliminating disparities? Are we getting to just outcomes? So hopefully that gives us a little bit of grounding at this point about what we mean by equitable systems change. And now we can dive into 4 characteristics that we've seen so far in equitable systems change. And Sean, Reverend Ross, and Lauren are going to walk us through these and tell us real stories of how they look on the ground.
Yes, so we're going to review the 4 characteristics first, and then we'll do another poll question. And then we'll have both Reverend Ross and Lauren talk about their own work in the context of these 4 characteristics. So the first of the characteristics of equitable systems change is that, that the work is grounded in a sense of shared humanity, that resources and that the work resources and reinforces decisions being made by communities affected by injustice. So this question of who actually is receiving the investment and resources to be able to take action. That it addresses the internal condition of the intervener as well as the system. So an element of self-care is also critical. And also that it shifts the role of power from reinforcing systems of injustice to sparking equitable change. So given that overview of the characteristics, we're going to do another poll question. So this question is really just, to what extent does the framework reflect what you're already doing in terms of systems change? And again, just to review again, that it's grounded in shared humanity, resources and reinforces decisions made by communities affected by injustice, addresses internal condition of the intervener as well as the system, and shifts the role of power from reinforcing systems of injustice to sparking equitable change. So to what extent is this framework of these 4 characteristics reflecting the work you're already doing in systems change? So weigh in, and we will get a few more responses to the poll, and then share the findings, and then we'll continue with Reverend Ross and Lauren sharing some stories from their work that illustrates these characteristics. Okay, so half are saying that they're already doing this but haven't named it, which I think is really great because one of the things that led to the development of this webinar was a very interactive conversation with people connected to BMP and MAG who were already doing the work. And part of what we wanted to do was unearth the insights and lessons and create a little bit of a container and a framework, because we knew that there were already a lot of insights from work that people were doing in communities on the ground. And so that's part of why we are also so happy to have Reverend Ross and Lauren with us to share stories from their own work. So let's move on. So again, the first characteristic that we wanted to talk about is the importance of the work being grounded in a sense of shared humanity. And here what we really think is that systems change effort has to be aligned around a vision of change that recognizes the individual needs of everyone, and that the effort seeks to repair and restore and lift up relationships and connections, so that there's shared stewardship for change. So I wanted to invite both Reverend Ross and Lauren to share your thoughts on this element, this characteristic, and how it relates to the systems change efforts that you both have been a part of. So can we start with Reverend Ross? Can you talk a little bit about how this value of shared humanity has been threaded through the work that you've been doing with the community radio?
Okay. Well, of course, community radio is very much just that. It can't operate and function without everybody in community. We are all volunteers. But it does bring in an interesting opportunity for this shared humanity piece, because community radio crosses all of the generational things. It crosses all of the things that go on in community. We bring in every voice that we can. Our aim and goal every week is to have at least 100 voices on air talking about their work and their relationship to community. The interesting thing is it could never have been launched without this shared humanity, because it was community on the ground actually raising the funds that got us up and got the station going. So we value the shared humanity piece. We definitely embrace that in the programming that we do 24 hours a day. We cross all of the generational barriers that would be there to make sure that community has a voice, that we are no longer deliberately silenced or bullied into silence, but we have the platform to raise that voice for all communities.
Thanks so much. And Lauren, can you talk about the way that you have grounded your work in shared humanity and the impact that that's had in terms of addressing some of the us versus them mentality that otherwise might exist?
Sure, Sean. There's a Mayan term in that we use in my parents' country called it goes like this: "En lak ech," "En lak ech," and it means you are the other me. And it's literally, you know, when you are hurting, I am hurting. What's in your best interest will be in my best interest. And that philosophy is one that I personally hold, and that is my teaching from my ancestors, and I think has helped me as someone who's now in philanthropy really continue to center this philosophy on shared humanity. And there, along the way of this journey with towards a racially equitable Monterey County, centering the healing is an absolute essential capacity. If we have to use language in the philanthropy world, it is a necessary philosophy that we must hold in order to undo the legacy of white supremacy that has served to separate us as people and as communities. And I want to share this one example. You know, in this ecosystem work of systems change, we have as I shared earlier, we had these 4 police officer involved shootings of 4 unarmed men, and there was this polarization and this divide. Understandably, due to the trauma that our communities have faced for generations. But in the work of our circle work in this Racial Healing, Racial Equity Week, we had police officers and members of the community in the space. And after that week of this work of healing, it was on the last day when we had this experience where a young man who was formerly gang involved had to sit with these police officers for the weekend. It was very difficult for him. And this exercise of sitting in space was where we saw this transformation. It was one of the police officers who was Latino, who was of color, who, and in the beginning they had entered this room and there was this uncomfortable tension. And he shared this story that that humanized the system that has been oppressing our community. And he shared the story that oftentimes he is seen by, he was born and raised in this community where these shootings took place, and he shared, and he was crying because he actually was from that same community, and now he's a police officer in the system. And that humanization of this man who grew up in this community is an example of how we have to find our collective humanity and recognize that the structures are pitting the way that they exist, and that the way that they've been formed are meant to separate us, and that the healing must be a capacity we continue to, although we don't often think about healing when we think about systems change, that is the direction that we continue to move in order to move in this long march of healing and transformation.
Thank you so much. We'll move to the next characteristic, and this is that it resources, the system change effort resources and reinforces decisions made by communities affected by the injustice. And so here what we're talking about is the redistribution and rebalancing of power, essentially. It's really important for communities who are directly impacted to be part of decision-making and meaning-making, and not just be informants. And so I think this is a particular critique of systems change processes that rely on sort of engineered feedback sessions that lead community members to basically endorse what was already going to be the outcome anyway. And I think that a lot of us have seen those processes play out in communities over the past few years. And so what we're really pushing for is real shifting the dynamics of power. And so this also does include elements of funding, as well as training and information. And so I wanted to turn it over to Lauren to talk, as someone working in a funding organization, a grant-making organization, the spectrum of community engagement, and the way that you're seeing community members be engaged in much more meaningful ways that do shift the balance of power.
Thanks, Sean. Yes, what we have observed, we hear a lot about government engaged in planning processes or community planning processes, for example, in land use decision making or in planning a recreational center and all in between. And oftentimes what we observe and what we feel and see is that much of those processes are transactional and they're not transformational. They're oftentimes rooted in this, we need to check off the box that residents were engaged. And that could be because it's a funding requirement. And you can really see when that is really superficial and transactional versus something that is really rooted in community participation and authentic participation. The key is, how do we get there? And the question is, how do we get there? And through the, we have been very fortunate to be able to stick around in a community for a decade, because what it has allowed us to do is really support resident leaders and their communities in sort of dreaming what would it be like to feel regarded and looked at by the system as a partner in wisdom, a partner that can actually not just be a transaction, but that can be used, whose information and knowledge can be used to really leverage the power of community for government to make sound decisions around policy and resource allocations. And what we came up with was this spectrum of community engagement, a process we call the spectrum of community engagement to ownership. And it's recognizing that oftentimes even government has good intentions, may have good intentions to engage community, but oftentimes it's tokenizing or marginalizing or placating. And so we have this process where residents, as part of their leadership development, they are able to assess government on those community planning processes. And this assessment happens at every community planning meeting, and it actually rates the city or the county or whatever the institution on these measures, this continuum. And now the city is doing is assessing itself, and we're sharing this information with one another. And that is so powerful, because what you see now is a city that actually wants to move community engagement towards collaboration and power sharing. And not in all the departments, but in some of our departments across the city, like planning, libraries, processes where the system and the leaders within the city want to actually feel that they're doing this work in a good way that is approved by residents.
Thank you. And so then with the third characteristic, what we're talking again about is shifting the role of power, talking again about power, but shifting the role of power from reinforcing systems of injustice to actually changing them. And so here, it's really important to just have understanding and acknowledgement that what we're talking about oftentimes is white supremacy and patriarchy, and how that has shaped systems and structures and then perpetuated inequity. and inequality. And so in systems change work, we have to have strategies that assess who has power, how we build power and redistribute it, and then share power to transform systems and prevent systems from resetting. Because we're up against dynamics of power that are really long-standing and entrenched, it's very, unfortunately, easy for systems change efforts to have an impact, but then for the system to be nimble and reset. And so I want to turn it over to Reverend Ross to talk a little bit about the dynamics around community radio and the actual systems and structural barriers that you faced in Detroit, because I think it's a really important illustration of how the rules of the game actually benefited or unintentionally, they seemed race neutral on their surface, but really did erect some barriers to community radio being embedded in Detroit and in urban communities, African American communities.
Okay,
So, Reverend Ross, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, actually, community radio was grounded and founded in rural white America. And it was actually founded as a result of those stations or those locations actually being fed up with white radio media in the first place. But then they reinstitutionalized that whole problem by alienating urban communities from it. So for 60 or 65 years, they have dominated. White rural America has dominated those frequency bands, those opportunities for urban areas, other groups to get community radio. And when it came to Detroit, there was so many problems that here, I was so naive. I had this license from the federal government sanctioned by Canada that we could have this radio station. But then we ran into Detroit, and not knowing that I had to get permits and licenses from Detroit, we ran up against those barriers of what the structure believed and didn't know anything about this thing called community radio. We have to have the most unique tower that they've ever created because of our location in the city and because of where our signal is coming from. And that antenna alone costs $10,000, where most white rural stations can basically put up a coat hanger, very similar to the kind of TV antennas we used to have on houses, and operate their stations. So for us to get the station and the signal here, we had to go through all the barriers and pressures that rural white America doesn't have to go through. There have been some tribal stations that came along in that first generation 60 years ago for community radio, but as far as lately, until this window opened up in 2014, we didn't even have an opportunity. But even at that, there were 1,400 licenses granted in that window. Probably 700 or 800 of those never got launched in urban areas, just because of the barriers, just because of the money situation, and because of the structure that had really been set in place and the guidelines that had come from white America.
Thank you. And so then moving on to the fourth characteristic, we think it's really important that systems change work addresses the internal condition of the intervener as well as the system. It requires the intervener, so the person making change, to look inward and tend to their inner health. And the change effort as well, in order to effectively spur change, we have to be altering, changing the dominant oppressive narratives that we tell ourselves again, but also supporting people to be grounded and in touch with their own emotions so that they can really be in relation with one another, again, bringing it back to being grounded in shared humanity. And so, in a way, what we're talking about is self-care. We have to heal ourselves. And so I want to open it up to both Lauren and Reverend Ross to talk about the ways that in your own work in communities, the system change work that you've been doing, you've seen this characteristic come into play. Lauren, can I start with you?
Sure. So something I don't think I've yet shared is I grew up in this central coast of California, and I remember I did not. When my parents came to this country, I didn't speak English was not my first language, and I remember going to kindergarten with my sister and being spoken to in English, and being taken to what they called Title I back in the 70s, because my inability to, because I didn't know English, the translation was, you must not be smart and you must not, you need help to catch up. And that feeling othered has always stayed with me. And I think when I had when I came back to Monterey County in this new role, that feeling of belonging or not belonging was with me. And I know that is deeply connected to how we manifest our trauma as adults. And so as I think about healing and systems change, there's this I remember early on talking to the endowment about my recommendations for investing, and that they had to really include a component around culturally rooted healing. And originally it was met with, why would you do that? Why would you? This is not about individual healing. This is about changing systems or changing policies. Well, fast forward 6-7 years, the reason why this work is so strong is because of going back to this, of addressing the trauma, that we cannot ask our community organizers to participate in systems transformation without supporting their ongoing healing, because they're not just carrying, they're carrying generations of trauma, and we have to recognize that. And the same goes for those that are within the system, that are particularly those that are trying to change the system. And that is, if we don't have support, the healing component, it makes it even more difficult to try to be a champion in the system. And then the last part, the last thing I will say is that healing together is important. It can't just be separate, because that's where we find our shared humanity. And that's where those moments of transformation happen, where the system feels less defensive, because it recognizes at the outside that the resident power isn't about undermining you as an individual in the system, but it's about working with you in a more synergistic way to transform the structures and the systems of oppression to transformation.
So I grew up as part of the civil rights movement in Washington, D.C., and I'm probably a lot older than most of the folks that are listening and watching this presentation today. And in a unique position, because I am a pastor, I am a minister, and people tend to see that as a resource for dumping anyway. I have to do a lot of counseling and a lot of work like that. And over the course of all of these years, as a minister, you continue to take this, you continue to internalize everybody else's situation and try to be that resource for people. And I really like it best when we talked the other day, and I shared that with Lauren, and she said, it's okay to say you are broken. So I think that in light of all the work that we do in Detroit, and certainly we've gone through some really, really difficult years, I think a lot of us are broken, and we haven't spent enough time in this particular part of it, and that is the healing. Perhaps you get so caught up in the work that there's so much to do that you don't take enough time to do that healing. So confessing today to all of these folks on this webinar, I am broken.
Thank you, Reverend Ross and Lauren, for being so vulnerable and sharing all those stories that brought this framework, you know, and particularly this last component here to life, and really made it real for us. Now that everyone is a little bit more grounded in the framework, and kind of going along this topic of inner work and development, I'm curious to hear, to do another poll and to hear where people are in terms of developing, like they're building their muscles or doing work within each of these 4 components, like where you feel the strongest and where you feel like you might need more work. And I think, one thing, as you're digesting these components and thinking more about this framework, I want to say that not every systems change effort needs to do all of these things with equal force, and kind of prioritize them in the same way. So that's something, to think about as you're, using this to reflect on your own efforts as a practitioner. We'll give folks a couple more seconds to fill in, because this is a longer one and might require a little bit more reflection. I'm also reminded of something, Lauren shared a couple calls ago when we were talking about addressing the internal condition of the convener that really stuck with me. And she said, if you don't heal yourself, you'll be as sick as the system that you're in, right? We're all working in broken systems and sick systems. And that really, really resonated with me. So it looks like people feel the strongest in the first bucket, grounding their systems change effort in shared humanity. And it's interesting to see, drop off as we go down, and really the hardest work is that inner work piece at the very end. And then looking at where folks see room to grow. It's interesting how fewer folks felt like in addressing the internal condition was, like, fewer folks named that as the strongest part, but that pattern didn't hold true here. People are prioritizing shifting the role of power as being one of the most important pieces of systems work. And that's really interesting to me, because I would imagine that pattern would flip. Well, thank you for sharing and, having your own vulnerable moment in taking this poll. I want to pass it to Susan to tell us a little bit more about the process of growth and learning and building the systems change and equity muscle.
Great, thank you. We've covered a lot of ground on this webinar, from deep equity to systems to equitable systems change and the 4 characteristics. One last parting thought that we as a team are grappling with, which is how are people developing a systems thinking mindset with an equity frame, right? And this diagram is our attempt to kind of flip the script on how that happens. I think traditionally we think that, you learn, you understand the best practices, and then you implement. One of the things that we've noticed from being with folks who've gone from the process of systems thinking in a more conventional approach to equitable systems change is that it actually starts with noticing, and then you do learning through trying over and over and over again, and finally you get to an irrevocable shift that you really can't come back from. And even in that shift, there's ongoing learning, which isn't on this diagram. We need to add it. I like to think of it as like a trapeze act. And it's as if folks are hanging onto that trapeze of systems change that's conventional. And as they're hanging onto it, they're like looking around and they're noticing, oh, there may be a different way to do this. And maybe it's from hearing great stories like what Reverend Ross and Lauren have shared with us, or maybe it's just looking at your own initiative and seeing patterns and the questions that come up over again, or different bright spots that are a little bit different. And it starts to raise this question, okay, equity matters, and what can I do about that? And then that leads into starting to grab at equitable systems change through this learning process. And we just want to name that the learning process is actually really messy. Like, it can feel like you're making 2 steps forward, but you're really going 5 steps back over and over again. And folks stay really persistent in this era. And I think that's important because sometimes it can feel like I'm not getting the outcomes I want. I'm not moving as fast as I want. I'm going off on a tangent. Maybe I've created harm I didn't intend. So you can take it really personal, this learning phase. But we want to say that there are folks that they keep learning and they keep trying, and ultimately they get to this frame shift. And for us, the frame shift is the moment that folks, they leap to the next trapeze, which is equitable systems change, and they can see the invisible net of the system below them. And at that moment, there's kind of no going backwards. And the way that you're operating as a systems change practitioner, it is embedded with equity in everything you do. And it can be very hard actually for those folks who've made the frame shift to actually name what is it that we're doing. So I just want to say that like this webinar actually was our attempt to surface what folks like Reverend Ross and Lauren are doing on the ground and help us articulate it so that we can all be more rigorous and we can all do more learning about what does it really mean to do equitable systems change. It really is the beginning point, not an ending point. And hopefully you will be able to join us. I got lost in that excitement, but I also want to just invite Lauren and Reverend Ross to kind of share their thoughts about how they've been experiencing the journey of folks who are more and more developing an equity frame as how they're doing systems change. So Lauren, maybe you could go first.
Sure. This graph is, when we were first talking about this in anticipation of this presentation, you can't help but feel like how much you feel you don't, there's no cookbook, there's no recipe, there's no guide for how to do this. And I have to say I've had my share of times where I just say I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm failing forward, and I think in that failing forward is where you have the greatest learning moments. And I think the group that keeps me most accountable is the residents of the community I get to work in. And I have to remind myself that I am working in an institution, the field of philanthropy, where we ourselves come from the legacy of systemic oppression. We have to grapple with that and recognize it. And so even though we have good intentions, we oftentimes manifest unintended consequences. And I don't say that so that we can feel bad. I say that because it's part of our liberation to be able to own that as in the field of philanthropy. I think that's really important, and that's been a frame shift. And I would say I'm a funder, but I'm also working on systems change because I'm trying to get our system, our foundation to do more of that inward facing work. So we can have deeper, more meaningful impact. It's been my learning.
So I think in this particular diagram, I feel this more in the community land trust work that I'm doing, and maybe that's because that's where I am deeply involved right now, is trying to make a difference in housing in Detroit. And we're creating a model that has never existed before, even though land trust are very old model. What we're doing with it here in Detroit, there is no example of it anywhere in the country. So I constantly feel like I'm in this model, in this failing forward, and I'm keep trying and doing, and I'm just caught up. And most days I sit and cry over it because I'm way behind where I thought I should have been, but I keep going forward, but then I go backwards. So I really feel this model in the community land trust piece in trying to do housing for folks that are in that 30% and below AMI, wherein I can't seem to get ahead of any of it.
Thank you. Thank you. This really is a journey that we're all on, and it's continuous, and we will never give up. So thank you for your stories. I'm going to pass it back to Natalie.
Yeah, thank you again. And I'll say that, you know, we as a group, the group of panelists, the folks putting together this webinar are on our own journey. And this is really just a first step and the beginning of a conversation that we hope to continue to have with all of you. I want to say a couple words of thanks. Actually, I think we should open up to questions. I'm sorry, I just noticed the time. You know, we have plenty of time left and people have been asking really wonderful questions. So I want to lift up a question from Ellen Grzinski. I'm sorry if I am mispronouncing your name. She asked how, you know, communities aren't a monolith, like there's no one community. When you think about community and your systems change efforts, how are you identifying all of the different communities that are part of that work? So I want to pass it to, I don't want to put anyone on the spot. It looks like you both are thinking, but Reverend Ross, are you, it sounds like you have an answer on the tip of your tongue.
You know, and that's true. All the communities are different, but the work that we're doing spreads all over the city and it's affecting everybody. The radio is, it's called NUC, North End Uniting Communities, because that's the effort of the station, to bring those communities together, to share in this resource, but also to do the healing that this resource is aimed at healing. The housing trust, we are located in all of the city. We have properties in every district of the city. So we're involved in all of those communities. Whatever their characteristic is or makeup is, we've had to bring that into this process and show them how to use this resource and be a part of this equity. So even though there is such a difference, we've had to try to find a way to unite those differences.
Thank you, Reverend Ross. Lauren, I'm curious, how do you think about the different communities that are involved in your systems change efforts?
Great question. So at the initial start of BHC, the foundation had asked the communities to outline the boundaries of the communities where we would be working in. And we've had so much learning from that specifically. At the time, the boundaries were very confined. Fresno, East Salinas, City Heights, a community in San Diego. And what we learned is if we're gonna support resident organizing and systems change, the boundary does not work. That does not even, and the intention was focusing on a boundary like where the inequities were greatest, right? And so the ecosystem of Monterey County now includes, you know, if we understand by definition, you know, structural racism means that that there are systems that are colluding with one another to perpetuate the inequities. It's not just the education system that it's kicking kids out, mostly kids of color. It's the justice system that's participating and putting them on probation. And so this ecosystem of Monterey County includes communities. When we talk about community, I'm not just saying this, this is what we hear from residents and people who work in systems, is that we're all we're one community, and that the systemic oppression has made us see each other as separate. They're over there, this community is over there, the funders are over here, and the systems, the government is over there. And that is that framing, that philosophy, that has to be changed, so that we're because the people who work in government are actually from this same community, and the more we separate, the less we're getting to equity. And so the question around, you know, who are the different communities, you know, we're starting to see, you know, we're starting to see our work as so deeply interconnected that we can't exclude a community in this work.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. We have another question around prioritizing healing and liberatory practice. So the question is, how do you prioritize those things within your systems change effort, within your work, when service needs are so great and when you might not have the capacity? How do you make space for that healing and address kind of the trauma of individuals operating in the system?
Natalie, I'm sorry, this is Lauren. I didn't hear the full question.
How do you prioritize liberatory practices and healing? How do you prioritize addressing trauma within the system, knowing that there's such a great need and there's such limited capacity?
I think Lauren is probably better able to answer that question, since I'm still working with that. And I know that, we saw in the polls that people seem to, that hasn't been as far along with other people in their strategy as, you know, it may be. So I think I have to pass this one to Lauren.
Sure. So the luxury of this initiative is the luxury of time. It's not just the resources. It's really, and it's how we're using these resources. The idea of healing is really, when we stop doing the healing, we don't move forward. I mean, we have examples of that where the city of Salinas, you know, we do something where we circle up. Our meetings are all in circles, and that takes, instead of an hour meeting, it takes 3 hours. And that's how it's, I mean, it takes, it not only takes time, but you have to prep people with a capacity to be able to hold space like that. And I don't really have an answer for it, but it's part of this learning, this noticing and learning graph, is that when that match is lit, when you light the match of healing, it's unstoppable. Like when people feel it and internalize it within a system, they don't want to go back to what they were doing before, because it's like an embodied leadership. It's very hard to explain. People ask me to explain how the healing is. How did you bring the healing, or how? And it's difficult to articulate. But what I can say is that once people are put in these spaces, and it is through a circle, it is through, as we do it, we honor 4 directions. We recognize our ancestors. We are engaging in agendas that are rooted in a circle, and it's what we're seeing is that folks and systems are tired of the way that things have been going, and they don't say it openly. They would never say, "Oh, because we have to get to this agenda." But once they get that experience, and the key is building the capacity of our young people and our adults to residents to be able to hold circle, and that has been transformational. Our meetings with the sheriff, with the police departments, we just had one last week, and to hear the police chief open herself up in the way that she did, we wouldn't be able to do that in more of a conventional, traditional meeting with an agenda.
And I'd like to add something on this piece around balancing vulnerability and sort of the caution around not re-traumatizing. So, you know, I think there's been a lot of research and body of work developed around trauma-informed care as service providers, as clinicians, as social workers. And so there's been also a comparable conversation that's been emerging among organizers around trauma-informed organizing. And how do we ensure that as organizers, as people who are pushing for change, that we are not relying on our community leaders to continually be tapping into the trauma that they have experienced in order to make the case for change. And so I think that it forces us to think differently about how we utilize story and personal narrative as a tactic for moving other targets to empathize with our communities and with making change. And so, you know, I think that the reliance sometimes on people telling the story of the ways in which they have been traumatized by systems and having to relive that over and over again, particularly during, like right now, in the conversation about the horrors of the brokenness of the immigration system. You know, I just think that those are things that we as change makers have to be really attuned to. How do we work, as Lauren was saying, with people to have the facility to manage and lead conversations themselves, reveal stories that are personal to them at points when they decide that it's strategic and they feel confident about doing it, and not rely on story as a tool or a tactic to move our targets. And because I think that that can be a way that sometimes we contribute to the re-traumatizing of our community members.
Thank you, Sean. And thank you to everyone for sharing your stories, to Reverend Ross, Lauren, Susan, and I also want to give a special thanks to a few other people who helped us today and helped us to get to this point today, who are listed on this slide here. There were many, many folks who contributed their thoughts to the development of this framework along the way. I also want to thank the artists who donated art that really brought beautiful vibrancy and color to today's presentation. Wasaba Sadibe, Monica Trinidad, and Rini Templeton, who contributed art via the Rini Templeton Foundation. So yeah, we are very grateful to those folks. A couple bookkeeping items before we wrap up. On the last slide of the presentation, which we'll send you, we have some resources, a link to Reverend Ross's radio station, Detroit's community radio station, some resources that Lauren shared. And then we'll also be sending out a copy of these slides and a recording of the presentation to everyone who participated. And you can also make sure that you get a recording by signing up for our newsletters. So those will, the recording will definitely be going out via those two channels. And then Noelia just sent out a survey, and we'd love for you to take the last 5 minutes of this session to just share your thoughts with us around how this went for you and what next steps you're looking forward towards. And that will help us shape whatever comes next, whatever comes out of this. And then the last thing I'll say is that so many people contributed wonderful questions that we didn't have a chance to get to, and we have made notes of those questions, and we'll be holding them as we think about what next steps can be. Is there anything else that you all want to share? Noelia, Sean, Reverend Ross, Lauren, Susan?
I think we're just really grateful for the many people who participated in the webinar. Thanks so much for taking the time to help start this conversation.
And just thank you
to Reverend Ross and Lauren.
Thank you for thinking there's value in all the struggles that we're going through in Detroit, that other people can learn from those experiences. Thank you for having us.
Thank the team and for connecting me to Joan Ross. It was just an honor to do this with you all. And this work, if you feel that it's overwhelming, just remember that it took 7, 8 generations to get to where we're at, and it's going to take another 7 generations. So this is a long march, and so yeah, let's leave you with that.
Okay. And we're looking forward to continuing to learn about equitable systems change in the future. It's a collective effort.
We're going to hang on for a couple minutes, I think, because if we sign off, people are going to lose the survey link. We'll also send it out in a follow-up email. So if you don't have a chance to fill it out now, we'll be sending it to you.
Noelia, I saw something about someone couldn't open a link, so I'll try to offline send it to you again for, I think it was the case study.
Great.
Great. Thanks so much. And if any folks are having trouble accessing the feedback survey, The link is right up here on the screen. It's Equitable Systems Change with an S after systems. And again, we'll be sending out all of these slides in a follow-up email along with a recording of today's webinar. So if you didn't get a chance to fill out the survey now, you will when we send out that follow-up email. Thank you all so much.
Great, thank you.